Hello everyone, my name is Ben, and I teach people about the anatomy of lifting. Today, we're going to go over specifically the middle delt, its anatomy, and how to maximize for targeting it during your lifting and resistance training. So first things first, and in sequence, what we're going to do in this video is we're going to go over the anatomy, right? So the basics of where the middle delt attaches, how it runs, its muscle architecture. And then we're going to go over the physics of really how to load it, right? Because in a resistance training setting, that's ultimately what we're doing is we're talking about or investigating the interaction between our anatomy and the external world, right? Physics. And so then once we have those two things sort of down pat and understood, we can talk specifically about what exercises, in my opinion, will be best suited for targeting the middle delt. So first things first, just to sort of go over the gross anatomy, this portion, which is sort of highlighted in red here, is the middle deltoid. Now we're going to look at this from a more specific anatomical perspective as well, but I just wanted to first highlight sort of visually, like on muscular people, what does this thing actually look like and what are we actually talking about? So again, the red highlighted portion is the middle deltoid, and just for reference, this green portion below it is the rear deltoid, which attaches to the scapula, the spine of the scapula specifically, and then above that point is the front deltoid. Now, from the sort of different perspective from the side, this is oftentimes where people are more so looking at the middle delt. This, again, highlighted in red, is sort of the bulk of the middle delt. Where exactly you draw this cutoff is somewhat arbitrary, as we'll see in just a moment here with some more specific anatomical references, but that is kind of what I identify as the middle portion of the deltoid. This sort of being the front portion of the deltoid, or the anterior portion of the deltoid, which attaches to the clavicle. And then again, this green back here is that sort of back side of the deltoid sweeping forward is the rear deltoid. Now, something that's really important to point out, and this comes from a somewhat recently published journal article on the deltoid specifically, is that there are many different portions of the deltoid. So we usually subdivide the delts into three sections: front, middle, and back. And I think for all intents and purposes, that's a completely fine way to go about doing it. But in a research setting, what they discovered is that there are technically 7 different functional subdivisions, which essentially means that there are 7 different parts. So this image right here is basically taking a sky view, right? So if you were above someone looking downward at their shoulder, this is the sort of the front side of the shoulder over here. And they represent the front portion of the deltoids as A1, A2, and A3. In other words, the first 3 portions of the delt. They represent the middle deltoid, and I'll contextualize this further in just a second, as this little tiny sliver right here. And then they emphasize or label the rear deltoid as the P1, the P2, and the P3, right? So this is what I referred to earlier, this space right here as the spine of the scapula. This is the clavicle, obviously, as it's labeled. And then this is sort of the side portion of the scapula, known as the acromion. And the acromion is this flat, bony prominence which sticks out on the side of the scapula. Now, for our intents and purposes with this particular video, and what I classify as the middle delt, really includes basically all of the deltoid that attaches to the acromion. So some people will label this the rear delt, and some people will label this the front delt. I'm personally just going to call it all the middle delt because that makes the most amount of sense to me. And so all these 3 points, which are meant to sort of label the insertion sites, by the way, the deltoid, if I didn't already mention it, attaches down about halfway down the arm, sort of in the middle side of the arm. Also known as the humerus. And these 3 distinct portions, again, which they designate as P1 and A3 respectively, right? The sort of outer side of the front delt and the outer side of the rear delt. Those to me all are sort of going to encapsulate the middle delt. So now that we've sort of got a basic understanding of what the anatomy is like, and specifically what I categorize as the middle deltoid, let's look at how the middle deltoid creates motion, what that looks like, and then also introduce some physics and how we can actually best load the middle deltoid. All right, so now that we've got Frank, the skeleton, to sort of help us out, let's go over some of the functional anatomy and how this thing actually moves the arm. So the major point to remember here, and this blue thing, this blue balloon is really just meant to represent the middle deltoid, which again, if I lean this forward, this is that acromion, this sort of flat thing on the side of the shoulder blade, which is really where that bulk of the middle delt attaches. And the main thing to remember is, as per this sort of silly little balloon here, is that the middle deltoid just controls the relationship between this bone, the humerus, and this bone, the scapula. It does not control shoulder elevation, upward rotation, which, by the way, basically look just like, you know, either the shoulder raising up, so this is shoulder elevation here. Shoulder upward rotation would be if you brought your arm sort of up to this point and your scapula and your clavicle needed to sort of pivot upward. That is the job of other muscles like the traps, the serratus, right, depending on the resistance direction, the rhomboids, whatever it happens to be. The middle delt just performs this role, which is it just moves this bone this way. Okay, and so when it contracts, it pulls these 2 points together, and because it just operates to control the relationship between this ball and this socket, it's not going to contribute to this, and it's not going to contribute to rotation upward. So what does that mean? That means that, and if you've heard anything about, you know, scapulohumeral rhythm, right? Basically what happens is this first sort of portion of shoulder rotation is really just coming from this relationship between the ball and the socket. In other words, it's really just coming from contraction of this middle deltoid, and again, of the other sort of portions of the deltoid that we discussed. And so because it's really just coming from the middle deltoid and it's not coming from all these other things, we really only need to train the middle delts most specifically, use this sort of bottom portion of the range, because that's the portion of the range that they're going to control more. Because once you start to get to this point, like around 90 degrees-ish, probably slightly before it, which obviously is subject to individual variance, what starts to happen is this entire unit of the shoulder girdle needs to start to pivot upward together, right? So notice what is happening is when I'm in this bottom position, right, the rotation is really substantially changing the length of this guy because that's where it contributes. But imagine I get my arm to 90 degrees and then I pivot my entire shoulder girdle upward toward the sky. Just sort of forget about this forearm position thing here. Notice that the relationship between this and this is exactly the same, right? So whether it's here or whether it's here, most of this motion, again, comes from that shoulder girdle. And so because it comes from that shoulder girdle, we really just need to kind of focus on this bottom end of the range. All right, so that's the motion, and that's really the primary function of the middle delt. That's what it does. It raises the arm that way. Now, there are some subtle differences in terms of where specifically you raise the arm, which I'll demonstrate in the exercise section in a little bit. But the short of it is essentially this. You can do raises directly out to the side and sort of maybe slightly in front of the body, and that'll be really, really specific to the middle delt. But remember that we discussed those three sort of distinct portions, which I lump into one category. And sort of within that one category, you can lump it into the sort of front side of the middle delt and the back side of the middle delt. Now, to train and stretch the back side of the middle delt, again, all of which is sort of on this portion, again, that we call that flat bone, the acromion, you would want to bring your arm slightly in front of your body and raise your arm slightly backward this way, right? Why? Well, because if you're moving from this position of being in front of the body to moving behind the body, these tissues are going to be the ones that are sort of lengthening and contributing to that motion. But if you bring your arm sort of back behind your body and move it toward in front of your body, meaning like a behind the body cable lateral raise versus something more like a cable Y raise where your arm is in front of the body. Again, this one being the thing that targets more of the back half of the middle delt. The one that targets more of the front half of the middle delt would be the one where you're stretching your arm backward behind your body. Why? Because that's the side of the joint that is being sort of opened by the resistance. That's an easy way to think about it. And sort of raising upward and forward in front of that will target more of the front half of the middle delt. Right? So you have multiple options. You can raise just sort of straight out to the side, get an even blend of all these things. You can raise from slightly forward to backward, getting a little bit more of the back portion of the middle delt, or you can raise in a direction which is coming from behind your body to sort of somewhat in front of your body, which will train more of the front portion of the middle delt. Now, the last thing that I want to go over in relationship to the physics now is how to load the upper arm. So a lot of people, when they're doing a raise, assume that they need to use a dumbbell. And what does a dumbbell do? It just wants to fall toward the ground. So if I'm holding a dumbbell, what is it doing in the bottom portion of the range where the middle delt is most active and potentially strongest and will contribute most? Well, the dumbbell basically just wants to pull the shoulder girdle downward, right? And again, if we think about muscle function and what we just discussed about the middle delt doesn't resist that. It doesn't pull the shoulder girdle upward. So instead of using something like a dumbbell in a standing position, which is just, at least at the bottom position, pulling our arm downward, of course, as we raise it, it starts to load the shoulder more. But proportionally, if our goals are to target the middle delt, we don't really need to do much of that, okay? So what is the solution? Well, we use a resistance direction, and I'm using this to represent resistance, which smushes our hand
into our body. So this could be a cable, and we'll go over exercise selections. We can set this up with the dumbbell, which I'll go over last. But we want the resistance direction effectively when our arm is sort of down close to our side to be close to 90 degrees or at least somewhat sort of angled this way, right? So again, just sort of humor me here. We basically just want a resistance direction that is pulling the arm into the body this way toward the bottom and not sort of down like this toward the bottom, right? So here it would be down like a dumbbell, at least at the bottom, and then here would be sort of, you know, where we could orient a cable or something similar, okay? So those are the main things. The middle delt, in essence, just controls the relationship between this ball and this socket, not this whole shoulder girdle motion thing, which again, you know, depending on the motion may or may not be something that you want to do. If you want to recruit more of the traps, that's something that you can integrate, but that's potentially for another video. So again, middle delt just controls this relationship, and what that essentially means is that it really just controls the bottom. We discussed the differences between the behind the back thing versus the sort of in front of the body thing, but ultimately, you know, regardless of how you chalk it up, we just want to perform raises in this sort of bottom 90 degrees for the most specific middle delt stimulus. So let's look at some exercise demonstrations now and how you yourself can actually set these exercises up.
So now that we have a good understanding of how the middle deltoid creates motion, and specifically the fact that it creates motion really only at what we call the glenohumeral joint and not the scapulothoracic joint or the sternoclavicular joint. Remember, the clavicle and the scapula move through different muscles, whereas the deltoid just manages the relationship of the arm and the shoulder socket specifically. Let's look at exercise demonstrations of how we would actually embody these exercises in real time. So in no particular order, here's a variation that I actually set up on a lat pull down machine. And I really want the focus with all the different videos that I'm going to show really just to be the principle based takeaways. Okay. I don't want you worrying too much about why is he doing it on a lat pull down? Why is he doing it on this functional trainer? Why is his body set up this weird way? Just really pay attention to what is the cable's relationship to my arm. And as a consequence of that, what is its relationship to my middle deltoid? So in this particular case, again, as we discussed in the physics section, I'm really just focused on raising in that sort of bottom portion of the range of motion, again, where the deltoid is going to act and contract the most amount possible relative to the total range of motion. Now, keep in mind that it's perfectly fine that if you're doing a raise where you're going over your head, as is true in this particular case, right, where I am sort of leaning sideways against a cable functional trainer. But what you'll notice is even when I do go overhead, right, because my goals for this specific exercise were to also sort of train the upward rotation qualities that we discussed, you'll still be training plenty of the middle deltoid, and the middle deltoid probably the most if you align the cable, as we discussed earlier, as, you know, a direction of resistance, which is sort of going more into the body as opposed to sort of out to the side, as we discussed, as would be the case in a standing dumbbell lateral raise. So in my estimation, the main important principle takeaway from these specific videos and from this entire YouTube video as a whole is that at the bottom portion of the range of motion, to train the middle deltoid, you just want the force direction to be smushing your arm into your body. Right, so you can think about that from the perspective of your hand being smushed into your leg in this particular case. In this particular case here, you can think about it as the hand being smushed sort of towards my butt. You could also think about it as like your triceps are being smushed into your lats. And again, we're sort of avoiding that concept of loading the arm straight downward, as we might in some sort of like trap exercise, or again, the traditional dumbbell lateral raise. Again, it's not that the traditional dumbbell lateral raise doesn't train the middle delts, it's just relative to these other options that we have available, it's far less specific. So what are some other options here? And I wanted to be a bit more specific about this. So the previous two variations, because of specifically where I was raising my arm, and I sort of briefly mentioned this in the context of the skeleton demonstration, but just to sort of reiterate, these two variations, because I was sort of raising straight out to the side and slightly forward, it's a little bit difficult to tell right in these two videos, but I'm actually not just raising directly out to the side, I'm raising slightly forward. Because I am raising slightly forward, right, that'll be more of a specific focus on the side portion toward the front portion, right, rather than the side portion toward the back portion, which we'll discuss in just a second. So when we look at this from the perspective of this particular motion here, you can see that unlike the prior two variations, again, where my arm was sort of getting pulled down into my side directly and I was raising slightly forward in front of my body, or pretty close to directly out to the side rather, in this particular variation, I am sort of mimicking somewhat of a similar motion, but instead of going out to the side, I'm sort of moving from front to back. And so when I move from front to back, as we discussed, this posterior portion of the middle delt, which I'll just call the P1 because it's labeled here, will contribute a little bit more relative to if I do something where I'm intentionally loading my arm behind my body, as is the case here, right? So think about it this way. This first variation that we just showed right here, my hand is getting sort of pulled forward and across my body. And because it's getting pulled forward and across my body, the things on the back side of the joint, these two guys, are going to contribute the most. But when my arm is getting pulled backward and behind my body, the things that are on the front side of the body are going to help me the most. So this would be a variation if you're angling the cable behind you, sort of close to your butt. Again, also just to point out, again, heavy toward the bottom portion of the range. Again, that 90-degree angle toward the bottom where my hand is getting smushed into my butt. This will be a variation which biases a little bit more of that M1, A3 area and potentially some of that A2 area, just for reference, okay? So we've gone over a bunch of different cable variations. What about dumbbells? If you do want to use dumbbells, or if you don't have access to cables or other kinds of machines, how can you set up a dumbbell raise to be super effective for the middle delts? Because it is possible. We just have to make some minor adjustments to how we're setting up.
All right, so just to sort of wrap this video up, when we're talking about dumbbells and how you can specifically, I'm pretending this is a dumbbell, use a dumbbell to train your middle delts most specifically. Of course, could you just do the standard dumbbell lateral raise? Yes, but I don't think it's the best option. And I think for a lot of people, it just ends up feeling like a really trap-dominated motion for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So what can we do and how can we help this? Well, again, that main principle is just we want our arm to be smushed into our body, right? So whether it's single arm, double arm, doesn't matter. We just want the arm coming into the body. So we can do that easily with one or multiple cables where we're sort of angling the cable sideways and we're raising against it. But if we don't have access to cables, or for whatever reason you don't like your cable machine, maybe it's old, clunky, super frictiony, you can take a dumbbell, okay? And now I'm just gonna sort of pretend that this is a bench or something. I'm just standing on a seat. And what we can do is we can sort of lean sideways like this. So don't assume that I would go into the gym and go onto a chair like this and have to support myself. It would be more like I'm sort of lying down this way, let's say. And so now if I do a dumbbell lateral raise this way, the resistance, yes, still straight downward, but now because I've changed the relative position of my body, I can effectively have this dumbbell just smushing my arm downward this way into my body, again, as we went over, and I can just sort of grease this groove and use this position, right? And so once you're here, if you find this uncomfortable, well, maybe try turning your torso toward the working arm. Maybe try turning your torso slightly away from the working arm. See what feels better, but ultimately you've accomplished the goal that we're sort of describing here precisely for the middle delt, which is you're having a resistance, smush your arm into your body. And the second that you stand up and you're using a dumbbell here, the dumbbell is no longer smushing your arm into your body, it's just pulling your shoulder girdle downward, which again is a thing for the traps and the levator scapula and other elevation muscles to have to sort of manage. So hopefully this video was helpful. If it was, please give it a like, a subscribe, a comment, and let me know if you have any questions on middle delt training specifically.
If you like this content and you want to learn more from me, you definitely need to check out the Modern Meathead community. Inside the community, you'll get direct access to me for one-on-one personalized feedback. In addition, you'll get access to hundreds of hours of premium content exclusive to members only. When you get inside the community, you'll get direct access to all these different features. Now, I make daily posts covering different exercises where I post videos of exercises directly, the anatomy of those exercises, and very specific breakdowns relative to whatever the goals of that exercise are. In addition, members are posting things every day with comments and questions of their own. And what you can see is as we go through all of these different kinds of posts, I respond to everything, every question, every comment directly, and I'll give direct feedback in the comment sections to all the different exercise variations you post. In addition, when you look over to the left side of your community, we have all these different community forums, but you'll also get access to all these different courses that I have on biomechanics, programming, pain-free training, as well as coaching and cueing. And when you click into the course, you'll see your videos on the left and then all the different other videos of the course on the right side. In addition, you'll also get access to an exercise library where I'm constantly adding new exercises, basically everything that I film in the gym with step-by-step tutorials. You'll also get access to previous Q&A recordings that I do on Instagram and live in the community, as well as all these other specific member lectures, which can last from 30 minutes to an hour every single week. You'll also get access to premium articles, ebooks, and all of my training programs with just one subscription. So if you want to learn more about the anatomy of lifting and a community of like-minded individuals who are all lifting obsessed, you can start your 7-day free trial, zero risk subscription today.